I never thought my grandmother's endless Sicilian lessons would save my life. Or anyone else's, for that matter. But there I was, standing in the middle of Carmine's, Manhattan's most exclusive Italian restaurant, where reservations cost more than my monthly rent, holding a bottle of Barolo that probably cost more than my car, watching a man sign his own death warrant. My name is Elena Mazzini, and I've been invisible my entire life. 23 years old, working 3 jobs to keep my head above water in this relentless city, always moving through spaces where people like me aren't supposed to exist. The daughter of immigrants, granddaughter of a woman who refused to let the old ways die. I learned early that being unseen was a survival skill. In places like Carmine's, where Wall Street titans and dangerous men in expensive suits made deals that moved millions, waitresses were furniture. We poured wine, cleared plates, and disappeared into the background like ghosts. That night started like any other. The dining room glowed with amber light from crystal chandeliers, casting golden shadows across white tablecloths and gleaming silverware. The air smelled of truffle oil, aged Parmigiano, and money. That particular scent of wealth that clings to people who've never worried about anything as mundane as rent. I moved through my section with practiced efficiency, my black uniform pressed and perfect, my dark hair pulled back in a neat bun, my face arranged in the polite, neutral expression that made me forgettable. Table 12 was occupied by 2 men I'd never seen before, though one of them commanded attention the moment he walked through the door. Dario Cataneo. I didn't know his name then, but I knew the type. The kind of man who made other men step aside without saying a word. He was perhaps 32, 33, with thick dark hair slicked back in that classic Italian style that screamed old money and older power. His suit probably cost more than my entire year's salary. Charcoal gray with subtle pinstripes, tailored so perfectly it looked like a second skin over his broad shoulders and muscular frame. A gold Patek Philippe watch caught the light every time he moved his wrist, and a thin gold chain disappeared beneath his collar. His hands were strong, scarred across the knuckles, hands that had done violence and worn expensive rings while doing it. But it was his face that made people nervous. Sharp cheekbones, a jaw that looked carved from marble, and eyes the color of espresso that seemed to calculate the worth of everything and everyone in the room. When he looked at you, it felt like being appraised by something ancient and predatory. I'd served dangerous men before, but this one was different. This one wore danger like cologne. The man sitting across from him was older, perhaps 50, with silver threading through his dark hair and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Luca Santori, though I wouldn't learn his name until later. He dressed almost as well as Cataneo, but without the same effortless authority. He was handsome in that aging Italian way, distinguished and careful, with manicured hands that gestured expressively as he spoke. But there was something oily about him, something that made my instincts prickle even as I approached their table with the wine list. "Good evening, gentlemen," I said in my practiced waitress voice, the one that was pleasant and forgettable. "Can I start you with something to drink?" Cataneo glanced at me for perhaps half a second, long enough to register my existence, not long enough to actually see me, and returned his attention to Santori. "Bring us the Barolo, the 15 Canubi." I nodded and disappeared, grateful to be dismissed. In the kitchen, I found the bottle, $1,500, casual as breathing for men like that, and returned to their table. As I poured, I couldn't help but overhear their conversation. Not that I was eavesdropping exactly. It's just that waitresses learn to tune into tables, to anticipate needs before they're spoken. It's part of being good at the job, part of being invisible enough that people forget you have ears. They were speaking Italian, which didn't surprise me. Most of the wealthy Italians who came to Carmine's did. But as I finished pouring Cataneo's glass, Santori leaned forward and switched to something else entirely. Dialect. Sicilian dialect, to be specific. The old kind. The kind my grandmother, Nonna Rosa, had drilled into my head since I was 6 years old. U cani ca tradisciu patruni, Santori murmured, his voice low and conspiratorial. The dog who betrays his master. My hand didn't shake, but my heart did. That phrase was specific, coded. Nonna had taught me dozens of old Sicilian proverbs, explaining that in the old days, before cell phones and encrypted messages, the mafia communicated through seemingly innocent sayings. Each phrase had layers of meaning, contexts that transformed innocent words into instructions, warnings, declarations of war. I set the bottle down carefully and stepped back. But I didn't leave. Something told me to stay, to listen. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was the way Santori's eyes had flickered around the room before speaking, checking to see who might understand. Maybe it was the ghost of Nonna Rosa, who'd spent her life teaching me to recognize danger even when it smiled. Cataneo laughed, a sound without humor. Luca, sempre custi proverbi antici. Always with these old proverbs. But Santori continued, his voice taking on an edge that made my skin prickle. Cutrata coi lupi impara a ullari. He who deals with wolves learns to howl. Then, more quietly, E certi lupi venu u propriu brancu pi mangiare meglio. And certain wolves sell their own pack to eat better. My blood went cold. These weren't casual phrases. These were messages, communications in a code as old as Sicily itself. And they all revolved around one central theme: tradimento, betrayal. I moved to the next table automatically, my body on autopilot while my mind raced. Why would Santori be speaking in codes about betrayal to a man who clearly trusted him? They'd arrived together, sat together like old friends or business partners. Cataneo had that relaxed posture of someone comfortable, someone who didn't see danger across the table. But I'd grown up hearing Nonna's stories of how the old mafiosi used to communicate, how they'd sit in restaurants and cafes speaking in proverbs that sounded like folk wisdom, but contained instructions for murder, theft, territory disputes. She'd made me memorize them, not because she wanted me in that world, but because she wanted me to recognize it, to stay away from it, to know when danger was wearing a friendly face. I circled back past table 12, clearing empty plates from a nearby table but keeping my ears open. Santori had pulled out a leather folder, expensive and official-looking, and was sliding papers across the table to Cataneo. Il contratto che abbiamo discusso, he said smoothly, switching back to Italian. The contract we discussed. Everything we talked about, the partnership with the Calabrians, the property consolidation, the international shipping routes. It's all here. We sign tonight, we move forward tomorrow. By next week, you'll have doubled your legitimate holdings and tripled your operational capacity. Cataneo picked up the contract, his expression thoughtful. He was the kind of man who read everything carefully, who trusted his instincts, who'd survived in a world where carelessness meant death. But even careful men had blind spots, and Santori had clearly been positioning himself in that blind spot for a long time. As Cataneo read, Santori's eyes roamed the restaurant, and for one brief moment, they landed on me. I was standing near the bar, polishing wine glasses, completely unremarkable in my black uniform. His gaze passed over me like I didn't exist, which was exactly what I wanted. But in that moment, I saw something in his expression: satisfaction, anticipation, barely controlled excitement, the look of a man about to win something he'd been chasing for a very long time. I set down the wine glass and moved closer, pretending to check on the nearby tables, and strained to read the contract over Cataneo's shoulder. The restaurant's lighting was dim, intimate, designed for secrets and romance. But I've always had good eyes, and I could make out fragments of text. What I saw made my stomach drop. The language was formal, legal Italian, but embedded within it were phrases that didn't quite fit. Clauses that seemed redundant, wordings that were oddly specific. And tucked into the margins in smaller print were notations that used the same structure as those old Sicilian proverbs. Conditional phrases that could be read two ways, depending on context. Nell'eventualità di successione amministrativa. In the event of administrative succession. Innocuous on the surface, but in the old codes, successione was also used to mean a transfer of power after death. Le proprietà consolidate revertiranno. The consolidated properties will revert. Standard legal language, except revertire in Sicilian code meant to return to original ownership, to undo a transaction, to reclaim what was stolen. This wasn't just a business contract. This was a trap, written in plain sight, using the ancient language of betrayal that only someone steeped in the old ways would recognize. And Santori had bet everything that no one at this table, that no one in this restaurant, would understand what they were really looking at. He'd bet wrong. Cataneo reached for his pen, a Mont Blanc that probably cost more than my monthly salary. His hand moved toward the signature line, and I saw my life split into two paths. In one, I stayed quiet, stayed invisible, let this play out however it was going to play out, served my tables, collected my tips, went home to my tiny apartment, and my student loans, and my normal, unremarkable life. In the other path, I opened my mouth and said something that would change everything. That would make me visible to men who preferred when problems stayed invisible. That would drag me into a world Nonna had spent her entire life trying to keep me out of. The pen touched paper. Santori leaned back with a satisfied smile, and I felt Nonna's voice in my head, fierce and certain. Ida ca vidi u tradimento e non parla e complici. She who sees betrayal and doesn't speak is complicit. I stepped forward, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might break my ribs. My voice, when it came out, wasn't the pleasant, forgettable waitress voice. It was sharp, clear, and unmistakably Sicilian. Non firmare. Don't sign. The entire restaurant seemed to freeze. Cataneo's pen stopped moving. Santori's face went from satisfied to chalk white in the space of a heartbeat, and every eye in that section of Carmine's turned to stare at the crazy waitress who just addressed the most dangerous man in the room, like she had any right to speak at all. The silence that followed my words was absolute, terrifying, the kind of silence that precedes violence. Dario Cataneo's head turned slowly toward me, those dark eyes focusing with an intensity that made every survival instinct in my body scream at me to run. His hand, still holding the Mont Blanc pen, didn't move. He was a statue, carved from marble and menace, and I had just done the unthinkable. I had interrupted him. "Ripeti," he said quietly. "Repeat that." His voice was soft, almost gentle, which somehow made it more frightening. Men like him didn't need to yell to convey danger. The threat was in the control, in the absolute certainty that he could end you with a word. My mouth had gone dry, but I'd already jumped off this cliff. There was no climbing back up now. I swallowed hard and met his eyes, forcing myself not to look away even though every cell in my body wanted to. "Non firmare," I repeated in Sicilian, then switched to Italian, my voice steadier than I felt. "Non firmare quel contratto è una trappola." Don't sign that contract. It's a trap. Santori recovered quickly, his face shifting from shock to outrage in practiced ease. "Chi esta pazza?" he demanded, turning to Cataneo with indignation that would have been convincing if I hadn't seen his initial reaction. "Who is this crazy woman?" "Mi scusi, signore." The manager appeared at my elbow, his face red with embarrassment and fury. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Cataneo. Elena, what the hell do you think you're—" Cataneo held up one hand, and the manager fell silent instantly. That's power, I thought distantly. The ability to silence someone with a gesture. He was still looking at me, those espresso eyes calculating, weighing, trying to figure out what I was. Threat or opportunity, crazy or credible, worth listening to or worth disposing of. Come ti chiami? He asked. What's your name? Elena Mazzini. My voice didn't shake. I was proud of that. E come mai una cameriera parla siciliano? And how does a waitress speak Sicilian? Not Italian Sicilian, but real Sicilian, the dialect. He'd noticed the distinction immediately, which told me everything I needed to know about how carefully he'd been listening. Mia nonna, I said simply. My grandmother. Rosa Mazzini, from Corleone. Something flickered in his expression at the town name. Corleone wasn't just famous because of movies. It was real, old, dangerous, a place where certain families had roots that went back centuries, where the old ways weren't just history, they were heritage. Luca, Cataneo said, still watching me, lasciaci soli un momento. Leave us alone for a moment. Dario, this is ridiculous, Santori protested, but there was an edge of desperation in his voice now. She's nobody, a waitress trying to... Luca. Just his name, but said in a tone that brooked no argument. Santori's jaw clenched, but he stood. As he passed me, he leaned close enough that I could smell his expensive cologne and whispered in rapid Italian, You just made a fatal mistake, puttana. Whore. Then he was gone, heading toward the bar, and I was alone at the table with Dario Cataneo and 4 of his men who'd appeared from various corners of the restaurant the moment tension had started. They were all watching me like wolves, watching a rabbit that had wandered into their den. Cataneo gestured to Santori's empty chair. Siediti. Sit. It wasn't a request. I sat, feeling the weight of every eye in the restaurant on my back, feeling my career at Carmine's evaporating with every second. But I'd already burned that bridge. Might as well see where this road went. Spiega, Cataneo said, sliding the contract toward me. Explain. I pulled the document closer, my hand surprisingly steady now that the die was cast. The restaurant noise had resumed around us, a gentle buzz of conversation and clinking silverware that felt surreal given what was happening at this table. This contract, I began in Italian, looks legitimate on the surface. Partnership agreement, property consolidation, international shipping rights. All standard legal language. I flipped to the second page, pointing to a clause near the bottom. But here, this phrase, nell'eventualità di successione amministrativa imprevista, in the event of unforeseen administrative succession. So, Cataneo's expression was unreadable. In standard Italian, that's just covering what happens if management changes. But in the old Sicilian codes, successione imprevista was used specifically to refer to power transfer after assassination. It appears in old mafia documents from the 1950s, the ones that were written to look like legitimate business contracts, but contained instructions for territorial takeovers after planned hits. I saw his eyes sharpen, focusing with laser intensity on every word. And here, I continued, warming to my subject now, pointing to another clause. This phrase about properties reverting to original administrative control, revertire al controllo amministrativo originale. That sounds like it means the properties go back to whoever owned them before the partnership, but revertire in the old code means specifically to return stolen property to its rightful owner. It was used when territory was taken by traders and then reclaimed. You're telling me my consigliere is using 100-year-old mafia code in a modern contract? Cataneo's voice was skeptical, but not dismissive. He was listening. Not just using it, I said, flipping through more pages. The entire contract is structured around it. Look at this section on dispute resolution. It refers to mediazione tramite canali tradizionali esterni, mediation through traditional external channels. What external channels? Who are the mediators? It's deliberately vague because in the old system, canali esterni meant rival families. Families outside your organization. I pulled out another page, my fingers moving quickly now. And this clause about Liquidazione progressiva di asset non performanti. Progressive liquidation of non-performing assets. Seems reasonable, right? Get rid of properties or businesses that aren't making money. Except the definition of non-performing isn't specified. There's no threshold, no metrics, no timeline. Whoever controls the external channels gets to decide what's non-performing. They could liquidate everything you own, piece by piece, and according to this contract, you'd have agreed to it. Cataneo had gone very still. He picked up the contract and began reading it again, but this time I could see understanding dawning in his expression. He was seeing what I was seeing, the trap, hidden in plain sight. "There's more," I said quietly. "Before you came to the table, Centauri was speaking to you in Sicilian. Old proverbs. Ucanica tradisci u patruni, the dog who betrays his master. Cutrata coi lupi impara a ulari. And he who deals with wolves learns to howl. And certi lupi venu u propriu brancu pi mangiari meglio. Certain wolves sell their own pack to eat better." Every single phrase was about betrayal, Signore Cataneo. He was telling you what he was doing, confident that you wouldn't understand the code. "Ma tu l'hai capitu," Cataneo said softly, "but you understood it." My grandmother made sure I would. She grew up in those times, in Corleone, when the families communicated in code because phones were tapped and letters were intercepted. She taught me to recognize the patterns, the phrases, the way old betrayals were discussed in language that sounded like folk wisdom. I met his eyes directly. "This contract isn't a partnership, Signore. It's a transfer of ownership. You sign this, and within 6 months, everything you've built will belong to whoever Centauri is really working for. And you'll be dead, killed in some unforeseen event that the contract conveniently anticipated." The silence stretched between us. One of his men, a massive guy with a broken nose and scars across his knuckles, leaned down and whispered something in Cataneo's ear. Cataneo nodded, but didn't take his eyes off me. "How do I know you're not part of this?" he asked. "How do I know this isn't some elaborate play to make me suspicious of Luca, so that whoever you're working for can move in?" It was a fair question. In his world, trust was currency, and I was a stranger asking him to spend it. "You don't know," I admitted, "but you can verify everything I've told you. Take the contract to someone who knows the old codes. Have them read it. Check Centauri's communications, his meetings, his financial records. I'm betting you'll find connections to families that should be your rivals, not your partners." I leaned forward slightly. "Or you could sign it right now and find out the hard way. But if I'm right, there won't be a second chance to back out." Cataneo studied me for what felt like an eternity. Then, slowly, deliberately, he set down the pen and closed the contract folder. "Franco," he said to the man with the broken nose. "Porta Luca qui. Adesso. Bring Luca here. Now." Franco disappeared, and Cataneo turned his full attention back to me. "Se ti sbagli su questo, pagherai con molto più del tuo lavoro. If you're wrong about this, you'll pay with much more than your job." "Lo so," I said quietly. "I know. E se hai ragione. And if you're right." He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung in the air between us. If I was right, I'd just saved his life and exposed a betrayal that went deep into his organization. If I was right, I'd just made myself either incredibly valuable or incredibly dangerous to him. Possibly both. Centauri returned to the table, Franco behind him like a well-dressed wall. He looked between Cataneo and me, and I saw the calculation in his eyes. He was trying to figure out how much damage I'd done, how much I knew, whether he could still salvage this. "Dario," he began, his voice smooth and reassuring. "I don't know what this girl has been telling you, but—" "Siediti," Cataneo ordered. "Sit." Centauri sat, his movements less confident now. "Elena here has been reading our contract. Cataneo said conversationally. She has some interesting observations about the language. The coded language. Santori's expression didn't change, but I saw his hands tighten on the armrests. Coded language? Dario, it's a legal document. Of course, the language is technical. Tell me about the Calabrians, Cataneo interrupted. The ones we're supposedly partnering with. The Valentino family. When did you first make contact with them? 6 months ago. Like I told you. Try again. Cataneo's voice was ice. When did you really make contact with Giacomo Valentino? The silence that followed was damning. Santori was good, controlled, but even he couldn't completely hide the flash of panic in his eyes. I want my lawyer, Santori said finally. No, Cataneo replied simply. You want to tell me the truth. Now. Because the alternative is Franco taking you somewhere private, where we can have a much longer conversation about your relationship with the Valentinos, about this contract, about exactly how much of my organization you've sold to them over the past 2 years. 2 years. He'd said 2 years, not 6 months, which meant Cataneo had already suspected something. Maybe not the specifics, but enough to have doubts. I'd just given him the concrete evidence he needed. Santori looked at me then, and the hatred in his eyes was pure and absolute. Puttana stupida, he hissed. Stupid whore. You have no idea what you've just walked into. You think Dario is going to protect you? You're nothing. You're nobody. The moment you're not useful, you're dead. Franco, Cataneo said calmly. Porta il signore Santori alla macchina. Andremo da qualche parte più tranquillo per continuare questa conversazione. Take Mr. Santori to the car. We'll go somewhere quieter to continue this conversation. Franco and another man lifted Santori from his chair. He didn't resist, but his eyes stayed locked on mine as they led him away. Sei morta, he mouthed. You're dead. Then he was gone, and I was alone at the table with Dario Cataneo and the ruins of my normal life. The restaurant had emptied around us while I wasn't paying attention. Cataneo must have given some signal, because suddenly Carmine's was closed. The other diners mysteriously departed. The staff vanished into the kitchen. It was just us now, sitting in the golden glow of the chandeliers like we were the only 2 people in Manhattan. Your grandmother, Cataneo said after a long moment. Rosa Mazzini from Corleone. Tell me about her. It wasn't a request, but his tone had shifted from threatening to curious, which I chose to interpret as a good sign. Maybe. Possibly. I was still trying to figure out if I'd saved my life tonight or ended it. She came to America in 1972, I began, my hands folded in my lap to keep them from shaking. The adrenaline was starting to wear off, leaving exhaustion and the first whispers of terror in its wake. She was 16, married to my grandfather Antonio. He worked in construction. She cleaned houses. They saved every penny so their daughter, my mother, could have a better life than they did. And she taught you the old codes. She taught me everything, the language, the history, the proverbs. She said the old ways were dying, that young Sicilians didn't speak the dialect anymore, didn't know the stories. She wanted someone to remember. I met his eyes. She also warned me to stay far away from men like you. A ghost of a smile touched Cataneo's lips. Smart woman. She died 2 years ago. Cancer. I was with her at the end, and she made me promise something. I paused, remembering Nona's frail hand gripping mine with surprising strength, her eyes fierce despite the morphine. She made me promise that if I ever saw the codes being used, if I ever recognized the old patterns, I wouldn't stay silent. She said too many people stayed silent in the old days, and it got good people killed. So you spoke up tonight because of a promise to your dead grandmother. I spoke up tonight because that contract would have gotten you killed, and I've seen enough death. The words came out more forcefully than I'd intended. My father died when I was 8. Construction accident, though everyone knew the site foreman had been cutting corners and ignoring safety violations. Nobody spoke up because they were afraid of losing their jobs. My father died because people stayed silent. Cataneo studied me with those dark, calculating eyes. You're not afraid. I'm terrified, I corrected. But fear isn't a good enough reason to let someone die when you can prevent it. He sat back in his chair, and for the first time since I'd interrupted his contract signing, he looked almost relaxed, or as relaxed as a man like him could look. Elena Mazzini, 23 years old, working 3 jobs, student loans from NYU, degree in linguistics with a focus on Romance languages and historical dialects, lives alone in a studio apartment in Brooklyn, no criminal record, no family except a mother who remarried and moved to Florida 3 years ago. He rattled off my life story like he was reading a grocery list. My blood went cold. You had me investigated. When? While you were explaining the contract. Franco made some calls. He gestured around the empty restaurant. It pays to be thorough, especially when a stranger claims to be saving your life. And? Did I pass the background check? You're clean. Suspiciously clean. No debts to anyone except the bank. No questionable connections. No reason to be involved in anything that happened here tonight. He leaned forward, his elbows on the table. Which leaves me with a problem. What problem? You saw the contract. You know what Luca was planning. You know about the Valentinos, about the betrayal, about all of it. His voice was matter-of-fact, businesslike, like he was discussing a shipping manifest instead of my potential murder. In my world, witnesses are liabilities, especially witnesses who understand what they witnessed. The fear that had been lurking in my chest since Santori was dragged away crystallized into certainty. This was it. This was where being useful ended and being a liability began. I'd saved his life, and now he was going to kill me to protect his secrets. I won't say anything, I said, hating how desperate I sounded. I'll forget everything. I'll quit this job, leave New York if you want. You'll never hear from me again. That's not how this works. Cataneo's expression was unreadable. You don't get to forget. You don't get to pretend tonight didn't happen. Because here's the thing, Elena. You exposed a traitor. Yes. But Luca wasn't working alone. He couldn't have been. A betrayal this sophisticated, a contract this carefully constructed, a conspiracy that's been running for 2 years according to my own security reports. That requires infrastructure. Networks, multiple people inside my organization. The implications hit me like a physical blow. You think there are more traitors. I know there are more traitors. Luca was the architect, but there are others. People who've been feeding information to the Valentinos, moving money, preparing the ground for the takeover. He picked up his wine glass, swirling the Barolo like we were having a casual conversation, and now I need to find them before they realize their plan has been exposed and scatter like rats. What does that have to do with me? Everything. He set down the glass. You read coded language that none of my people caught. You understood references that went over the heads of my most trusted advisors. You speak dialects that are dying out, no history that's been forgotten. And most importantly, you have no connections to my world, which means the traitors won't see you coming. The realization dawned slowly, terrifyingly. You want me to help you. I want you to work for me. Officially. As my translator, my cultural consultant, my expert in the old ways. You'll have access to documents, contracts, recordings of conversations. You'll review everything with fresh eyes, looking for more codes, more hidden messages, more signs of betrayal. He leaned back, his expression hardening. And you'll do it willingly, or you'll do it because the alternative is much, much worse. That's not a choice. No, he agreed. It's not. Welcome to my world, Elena, the one your grandmother warned you about. I wanted to argue, to protest, to tell him he couldn't just conscript me into his organization because I'd done the right thing. But looking into those cold, dark eyes, I understood with absolute clarity that he could and he would. In Dario Cataneo's world, there were only 3 categories of people: those who worked for him, those who worked against him, and those who were dead. I'd just disqualified myself from the 2nd and 3rd categories. What happened to Santori? I asked quietly. He's being questioned. Franco is very good at his job. By morning, we'll know everything. Who else is involved, how deep the conspiracy goes, where the money is, what the Valentino's endgame was. Cataneo's expression was flat, emotionless. And then Luca Santori will cease to be a problem. He was going to kill him. Of course he was. That's what men like Cataneo did to traitors. And I'd just handed Santori over with my big mouth and my nonna's lessons. I didn't mean for anyone to die, I whispered. Yes, you did. Cataneo's voice was sharp, cutting through my self-delusion. The moment you told me not to sign, you sentenced Luca to death. You knew it then, even if you didn't want to admit it. That's the weight of speaking up in this world, Elena. Actions have consequences. Words have bodies. You don't get to save one life without costing another. He was right, and I hated him for it. But I hated myself more for not having considered it, for being so focused on doing the right thing that I hadn't thought through what the right thing would actually cost. So what happens now? My voice was hollow. Now, you go home. You sleep, if you can. Tomorrow morning, someone will come to your apartment. His name is Marco. He'll bring you to my office, and we'll begin going through every document, every contract, every piece of paper that's crossed my desk in the last 2 years. You'll look for patterns, codes, anything that suggests Luca's co-conspirators. Cataneo stood, and I automatically stood with him. And Elena? Yes? Don't run. Don't try to disappear. Don't do anything stupid. Because while you're valuable to me right now, that value has conditions. Break those conditions, and Franco will come for you instead of Marco. Do you understand? I understood perfectly. I'd traded one cage, poverty, debt, invisibility, for another. And this new cage had much sharper teeth. I understand, I said. Good. He pulled out his wallet and extracted a stack of hundreds, setting them on the table. For your trouble tonight, and for your discretion. I looked at the money, at least $2,000, more than I'd make in tips in 2 months, and felt disgust rise in my throat. Blood money. Payment for betraying Santori, for becoming complicit in whatever happened next. But I took it anyway. Because I was broke, and bills didn't care about moral complexity. Cataneo walked toward the door, his men materializing from the shadows to flank him. At the threshold, he turned back. Your grandmother was right to teach you the old ways, Elena. But she was wrong about one thing. What's that? You can't stay away from men like me. Because men like me built the world you live in, carved out the spaces where people like you exist. We're in your restaurants, your banks, your government buildings. We're everywhere. He smiled, and it was the most frightening thing I'd seen all night. You were never far away from us. You just didn't know how to see us until tonight. Then he was gone, and I was alone in the empty restaurant with $2,000 in blood money and the certain knowledge that my life would never be the same. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my tiny Brooklyn studio, staring at the ceiling while traffic sounds filtered through the thin walls, and the money Cataneo had given me sat on my kitchen counter like an accusation. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Santori's face as Franco dragged him away, heard him mouth "say morta" with such conviction that I could almost feel the bullet before it came. But it wasn't Santori who would kill me, I realized as dawn broke over the East River. It was the choice I'd made the moment I opened my mouth. The choice between silence and speech, between invisibility and consequences. Nona had taught me to recognize the codes, but she'd never prepared me for what happened after recognition, after the speaking up, after the world shifted on its axis and left you standing in a new reality where men in expensive suits knew your address and your student loan balance. Marco arrived at exactly 7 a.m. I'd been awake for 32 hours, jittery on coffee and adrenaline, wearing the same black dress I'd worn to work the previous night because I couldn't decide what one wore to become complicit in mafia business. Professional? Casual? Did they have a dress code for unwilling consultants? Marco was nothing like Franco. Where Franco was massive and threatening, all violence barely restrained, Marco was slim and neat, wearing a gray suit that probably cost more than my rent. He had intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of polite, efficient demeanor you'd expect from a corporate executive's assistant, which I supposed he essentially was. "Miss Mazzini," he greeted me with a slight nod. "Mr. Cataneo is expecting you." "Of course he is," I muttered, grabbing my bag. "Wouldn't want to keep the boss waiting." Marco's expression didn't change, but I thought I detected the faintest flicker of sympathy. "For what it's worth, you made the right choice last night. There are few people who would have done what you did. I'm not sure right is the word I'd use. Perhaps not, but correct? Definitely." He held the door open for me. "After you." The car was a black Mercedes, sleek and anonymous, the kind of vehicle that cost more than most people made in a year. Marco drove in silence through morning traffic, navigating Manhattan's crowded streets with practiced ease. I watched the city wake up through tinted windows, watched people hurrying to their normal jobs with their normal problems, and felt the distance between their world and mine expanding with every block. We didn't go to a restaurant or a social club, the traditional headquarters of organized crime families according to every movie I'd ever seen. Instead, Marco pulled into the underground parking garage of a gleaming glass tower in Midtown. The building was corporate, legitimate, the kind of place where investment firms and tech startups leased office space. "Mr. Cataneo's legitimate businesses," Marco explained as we rode the elevator to the 40th floor. "Import-export, real estate development, investment portfolios, all perfectly legal. And the illegal parts are why you're here." The elevator doors opened onto a reception area that looked like it belonged in a Fortune 500 company. Marble floors, modern art on the walls, a receptionist who smiled professionally as we passed. "Follow me." Cataneo's office was at the end of a long hallway, a corner suite with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a breathtaking view of Manhattan. The man himself was standing by those windows, phone to his ear, speaking in rapid Italian about shipping schedules and container manifests. He'd changed clothes since last night, now wearing a navy suit that somehow made him look even more dangerous than he had in the restaurant. Maybe it was the morning light, harsh and unforgiving, highlighting the sharp angles of his face and the coldness in his eyes. He ended the call as Marco ushered me inside and closed the door behind us, leaving us alone. "Elena." Cataneo gestured to a chair in front of his massive desk. "Coffee?" "Is this the part where we pretend to be civilized?" I asked, not sitting. "This is the part where you decide if you're going to make this difficult or if you're going to be smart." He poured 2 cups from an espresso machine that probably cost more than my car. "I prefer smart. It makes everything easier." I took the coffee because my hands needed something to do. It was perfect, of course, rich and strong, and probably imported from some small Italian village where they'd been growing coffee beans for centuries. "Luca talked," Cataneo said without preamble, settling into his chair. "It took most of the night, but Franco was persuasive. The conspiracy is bigger than I thought. 8 people total inside my organization, all of them reporting to the Valentinos for the past 18 months. 8 people. My stomach clenched. Are they all being dealt with? Yes, quietly, efficiently. By tonight, the problem will be resolved. He said it like he was discussing pest control, not murder. But that's not why you're here. The conspiracy within my organization is handled. What concerns me now is the external threat. He slid a folder across the desk. I set down my coffee and opened it, finding photographs, documents, what looked like financial records. The Valentinos have been planning this takeover for 3 years, Cataneo continued. They targeted me specifically because my operations are the key to controlling the eastern seaboard. Take out my family, absorb my infrastructure, and they become the dominant power from Boston to Miami. The contract Luca tried to get me to sign was the final step. It would have given them legal ownership of my shipping routes, my properties, my legitimate businesses. And the clauses about unforeseen succession were cover for my assassination, which was scheduled for next week. I looked up sharply. Next week? There's a meeting scheduled with several Calabrian families, supposedly a peace summit to discuss territorial boundaries. In reality, it was going to be an ambush. I'd have walked in thinking I was negotiating, and I'd have been killed along with my key people. With me dead and the contract signed, everything would have transferred to the Valentinos legally. Clean, untraceable. But now they know you know. Exactly. Which means they'll accelerate their timeline. They can't let me move against them first. Can't let me expose their conspiracy to the other families. They need to strike soon, before I can consolidate my defenses. He leaned forward. And that's where you come in. I don't understand. The Valentinos have been communicating with their conspirators using the same codes you recognized in the contract. Old Sicilian proverbs, dialects, references that anyone listening would dismiss as cultural nostalgia. We have recordings of phone calls, copies of emails, text messages, hundreds of documents that my people have been treating as innocuous because they didn't understand the language. He tapped the folder. But you do. The weight of what he was asking settled over me. You want me to translate their conspiracy. I want you to give me every detail, every plan, every timeline, every person involved. I want to know what they're saying when they think nobody's listening. His eyes were hard, intense. You saved my life last night, Elena. Now I need you to save my organization. And if I refuse, then you become a loose end, someone who knows too much and isn't useful enough to keep around. He said it without heat, without threat, just stating facts. I don't want to kill you, Elena. You're valuable, smart. You did something last night that nobody else in that restaurant had the courage or knowledge to do. But make no mistake, if you're not with me, you're a liability. I sat down finally, my legs suddenly shaky. This was real. This was actually happening. I was sitting in a legitimate-looking office in Midtown Manhattan, discussing mafia codes and murder timelines with a man who could have me killed as easily as ordering lunch. How long would I need to do this? I asked. Until the threat is neutralized. Could be a week. Could be a month. Until I know everything the Valentinos are planning and have dealt with it appropriately. And then? Then we discuss the future. Maybe you go back to your normal life. Maybe you don't. Depends on how useful you prove to be. He opened a drawer and pulled out another folder, this one thicker. This is a consulting contract, $20,000 a week plus expenses. All you have to do is translate documents and attend meetings where the old dialects might be used. $20,000 a week. My student loans would be gone in 3 months. My mother could stop working herself to death in Florida. I could actually have a savings account, a safety net, a life that wasn't constantly balanced on the edge of financial disaster. And all it would cost was my soul, and possibly my life. What happened to Santori? I asked quietly. Luca Santori committed suicide this morning, Cataneo said evenly. Jumped from his apartment balcony, Tragic. The police are investigating, but early indications suggest depression and financial troubles. I felt bile rise in my throat. He didn't jump. No, but that's what the official story will say. That's how this world works, Elena. We maintain appearances. We operate within the systems of legitimate society while conducting our real business in the shadows. He pushed the contract toward me. Now sign this, or walk out that door and take your chances. But know that if you walk out, you won't make it home. Not because I want to hurt you, but because I can't risk what you know. I looked at the contract, at the dollar figure that would change my life, at the signature line that would bind me to a world I'd spent my whole life trying to avoid. Nonna's voice echoed in my memory. Stay away from men like that, Elena. They'll destroy everything you touch. But she'd also said, if you see betrayal and stay silent, you're complicit. I'd already chosen. The moment I'd said none for Mari and Carmine's, I'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. This wasn't about choosing between good and evil anymore. This was about choosing how I'd survive the consequences of a choice I'd already made. I picked up the pen and signed my name. Cataneo smiled, and for the first time, it reached his eyes. Smart girl. Now, let's get to work. We have a war to prevent. The next 3 weeks consumed me entirely. I lived in Cataneo's world, breathing codes and conspiracies, translating conversations that revealed a web of betrayal so complex it made my head spin. Marco became my constant companion, escorting me between my apartment and Cataneo's office, making sure I ate, occasionally reminding me that sleep was necessary for cognitive function. Franco loomed in the background, a silent reminder of what happened to people who became liabilities. But the most unsettling part wasn't the violence or the secrets. It was Dario Cataneo himself. He was brilliant. That became clear within the first day of working together. When I translated a coded message, he'd immediately grasped the implications, connecting it to other pieces of intelligence, building a 3-dimensional map of the Valentino conspiracy in his mind. He remembered every detail of every conversation, every person involved, every dollar that had changed hands. His mind was a steel trap, and watching it work was simultaneously fascinating and terrifying. Here, I said one afternoon, pointing to a text message transcript. We were in his office, papers spread across his desk, the late afternoon sun painting everything gold. This phrase, La luna è rossa stasera, the moon is red tonight. It's a reference to blood and danger. In the old codes, it meant an assassination was imminent. Cataneo leaned closer, reading over my shoulder. He smelled like expensive cologne and coffee, and I'd learned to recognize the subtle shift in his posture that meant his mind was racing through possibilities. The message was sent to Santori 3 days before we had that dinner, he said, which means the timeline for my assassination was already set. The contract signing was just formality. They were confident you'd sign. Because Luca had spent 2 years building trust, making himself indispensable, advising me on deals that actually worked, protecting me from threats that turned out to be real. He straightened, running a hand through his hair in a rare gesture of frustration. He was good, Elena. Better than I gave him credit for. If you hadn't been there that night. But I was. But you were. He looked at me then. Really looked at me. And something in his expression made my breath catch. It wasn't the cold calculation I'd grown used to. It was something more complicated. Respect, maybe. Or curiosity. Why did you do it? Really? You could have stayed quiet, collected your tips, gone home to your normal life. I told you. My grandmother. I know what you told me. I'm asking what you're not saying. He sat on the edge of his desk, his posture relaxed but his eyes intense. Nobody risks their life for a stranger because their grandmother told them to. There's something else. I set down the document I'd been translating and met his gaze. You want the truth? I always want the truth. Fine. I spoke up because I'm tired of being invisible. Tired of serving rich, powerful people who look through me like I'm furniture. Tired of having no control over my own life, no agency, no power. The words came out harder than I'd intended, edged with years of resentment I hadn't realized I was carrying. When I saw that contract, saw what Santori was doing, I realized I had something nobody else in that room had. For the first time in my life, I knew something important. I had power, and I used it. Cataneo studied me in silence, and I braced for mockery or anger. But what I saw in his face was understanding. "You wanted to matter," he said quietly. "I wanted to be seen." "Well, congratulations. You're very visible now." But there was no mockery in his tone. If anything, he sounded almost sympathetic. "Be careful what you wish for, Elena. Visibility in my world comes with consequences." I'm learning that. Over the following days, the dynamics between us shifted in ways I couldn't quite name. He started asking my opinion on matters beyond translation, testing my insights on strategy, on trust, on how to identify deception. I found myself staying later in the office, talking with him about everything from classical music to philosophy, to the nature of power. He was well-educated, well-read, capable of discussing Machiavelli and Marcus Aurelius with the same ease he discussed murder and money laundering. "You're not what I expected," I admitted one evening. We were working late, the city lights twinkling 40 stories below, the office dark except for the desk lamp and our computers. "What did you expect? A thug in a suit?" "Maybe. Yes. I don't know." I rubbed my tired eyes. "Someone more. Obvious. The obvious ones don't survive in this business." He stood and walked to the window, hands in his pockets. "My father was obvious, loud, violent, proud. He ran the family like it was still 1950, all guns and intimidation. It got him killed when I was 22. I'd researched his background after signing the contract, the official version at least. Dario Cataneo had inherited a struggling criminal enterprise and transformed it into a multi-billion-dollar operation that straddled the line between legitimate business and organized crime. He'd survived 3 assassination attempts, 2 federal investigations, and a war with the Genovese family that had left dozens dead. He was 33 years old and controlled an empire. "How did you do it?" I asked. "Build all this?" By understanding that the world changed. The old families were dying because they refused to evolve. They wanted to keep operating like it was the glory days of the Cosa Nostra, when politicians were bought and paid for, and law enforcement looked the other way. But that world is gone. Now you need to be smarter, cleaner. You need legitimate businesses that generate real revenue, lawyers who can navigate complex financial systems, politicians who genuinely believe you're just a businessman. And the violence? Still necessary, but surgical, precise. You don't kill people in broad daylight anymore. You destroy their credibility, their finances, their leverage. You make them disappear legally, and when legal methods fail. He turned from the window, his expression hard. Then you do what needs to be done, quickly, quietly, without witnesses. Like Santori. We stood in silence, the weight of that name hanging between us. I'd been complicit in his death. Every time I translated a document, every time I helped Cataneo identify a conspirator, I was complicit in what came after. The bodies that washed up in the Hudson, the accidents that weren't accidents, the people who simply disappeared. "Do you feel guilty?" I asked. "Every day." His honesty surprised me. But guilt doesn't change anything. The people I kill would kill me without hesitation. The businesses I run employ thousands of legitimate workers. The neighborhoods I control are safer than they were before I took over. I tell myself the good outweighs the bad. He smiled without humor. "It's probably a lie, but it's the lie that lets me sleep at night. At least you're honest about it." With you, yes. You've earned that much." He moved back to the desk, sitting down across from me. "The Valentinos are planning their move. We've translated enough messages to know they're gathering their forces. In 3 days, there's a scheduled meeting between all the major Calabrian families. They're going to use that meeting to declare a vote of no confidence in my leadership and formally absorb my territory. Can they do that? If enough families vote yes, it's legitimate according to the old traditions. The Cosa Nostra might be dying, but the traditions still hold weight. If I'm declared an unstable leader, if they can convince the other families that I'm bringing too much law enforcement attention or starting unnecessary wars, they can isolate me, force me out, or kill me with the blessing of the others. So we have 3 days to stop them. We have 3 days to expose them, to prove to the other families that the Valentinos are the real threat, not me. That they're trying to start a war that will bring federal heat down on everyone." He pulled out a map of New York, marked with territories and family boundaries. "I need you there, Elena, at the meeting, listening, translating, catching any codes they might use to coordinate their move." My stomach dropped. "You want me at a mafia summit?" "I want you to do what you've been doing. Listen, understand, give me the advantage." He met my eyes. "But I understand if you're not willing. This is different from translating documents in a safe office. You'll be in a room with men who would kill you without thinking twice if they knew what you were." It was a test. I realized that immediately. He was giving me a choice, waiting to see if I'd commit fully, or if I'd flinch at the moment of truth. Everything until now had been preparation. This was the real question. Was I in or not? I thought about my empty apartment, my vanished student loans, my mother calling to thank me for the money I'd sent her. I thought about being invisible again, going back to serving wine to men who looked through me. I thought about Nona's voice. "If you see betrayal and stay silent, you're complicit." "I'll be there," I said. "But I need something from you first." His eyebrows rose. "You're negotiating?" "You said I was valuable. Valuable means I get to ask questions." I leaned forward. "Why me? Really? You could have hired professional translators, linguists, academics who know these dialects better than I do. Why trust a waitress you just met?" Cataneo was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then slowly he smiled, a real smile, not the cold, calculated ones I'd seen before. "Because you were willing to risk everything to do what you thought was right. That kind of person is rare in my world. Usually people work for me out of fear or greed. You work for me because—" He paused, searching for words. "Because you care. About fairness, about truth, about stopping bad things from happening to people who don't deserve it. That makes you dangerous, but it also makes you trustworthy." "I don't feel trustworthy. I feel like I'm drowning." "Good. That means you're paying attention." He stood, extending his hand. 3 days, Elena. That's all I need. Help me survive this, and I promise you'll walk away from all of this with enough money to build any life you want. Far from me. Far from this world. You can go back to being invisible if that's what you want. I looked at his hand, scarred and strong, offering me a deal that I knew he might not honor. But I'd come too far to turn back now. The moment I'd said, "None for Mari," I'd chosen this path. All that remained was to see it through to the end. I took his hand. 3 days. His grip was firm, warm. 3 days. The meeting was held in a mansion in the Hamptons, a sprawling estate that belonged to one of the neutral families. I'd never been to the Hamptons, had only seen it in movies. White beaches, massive houses, the playground of people who summered as a verb. The reality was both more beautiful and more terrifying than I'd imagined. Marco drove us in silence, with Franco following in a second car with additional security. I sat in the back seat next to Cataneo, wearing a black dress that was more expensive than anything I'd ever owned. My hair styled professionally, a thin gold necklace with a hidden microphone around my neck. I looked like I belonged in his world now, like I'd been polished and perfected into something valuable. "Remember," Cataneo said as the gates of the estate appeared ahead, "you're my linguistic consultant. You're there to help with translation and cultural context. Nothing more. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't make eye contact with anyone unless necessary. And most importantly, stay close to me. What if they realize what I'm really doing? They won't. Men like them don't pay attention to women unless they're serving drinks or sharing their beds. You'll be invisible again, just the way you used to be." He turned to look at me. "Use that. Listen. Learn. Then tell me everything." The mansion was ridiculous. Marble everywhere. Artwork that probably belonged in museums. A ballroom where the meeting would take place that could have housed my entire apartment building. Men in expensive suits gathered in clusters, speaking in low voices, assessing each other like wolves circling territory. I recognized faces from the documents I'd translated. Giacomo Valentino, the architect of the conspiracy, standing near the windows with his sons flanking him like soldiers. Other family bosses, some allied with Cataneo, some neutral, some openly hostile. The air was thick with tension, with barely restrained violence dressed up in civilized clothing. I stayed at Cataneo's side as he moved through the room, greeting other bosses with careful courtesy, his body language projecting confidence and control even though I could feel the tension in him. He dressed for this like a warrior dressing for battle, a black suit that somehow made him look even more dangerous, his hair perfect, his face an emotionless mask. "Dario." Giacomo Valentino approached us with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He was older, perhaps 60, with silver hair and the kind of Mediterranean handsomeness that aged into distinction. "Good of you to come. And who is this beautiful young woman?" "Elena Mazzini," Cataneo said smoothly. "My linguistic consultant. She helps with translation and cultural matters." "Ah." Valentino's eyes swept over me, dismissive. "Pretty and educated. You always did have good taste, Dario." Then he dismissed me entirely, turning his attention back to Cataneo. "Shall we begin? We have much to discuss." The meeting started with formalities, the heads of families taking seats around a massive conference table, while associates and consultants stood along the walls. I positioned myself behind Cataneo's chair, close enough to hear everything, far enough to be unobtrusive. My hands were clasped in front of me, my expression neutral, every inch the professional consultant who was just there to do a job. But my ears were tuned to every word, every phrase, every subtle shift in dialect. The discussion started with territory disputes, minor conflicts that needed resolution. Standard mafia diplomacy, everyone being carefully polite while communicating veiled threats. Then Valentino shifted the conversation. "We need to discuss a matter of leadership," he said, his voice grave. "Specifically, concerns about stability in the New York operations." "Concerns?" Cataneo's voice was cold. "Be specific, Giacomo. There have been incidents, deaths that have drawn federal attention, financial irregularities, reports of internal conflict." Valentino looked around the table. "Many of us are concerned that your organization has become unstable, that you're attracting the kind of attention none of us can afford. The only instability in my organization was caused by traitors." Cataneo's voice was measured, controlled. "Traitors who have been dealt with. Perhaps you'd like to explain how so many of those traitors were connected to the Valentino family?" The room went silent. Valentino's expression hardened. "That's a serious accusation." "It's a statement of fact. Luca Santori, my former consigliere, was working for you, as were 7 others inside my organization. They were feeding you intelligence, moving money, preparing the ground for a takeover. Cataneo pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. I have documentation, bank transfers, recorded conversations, email exchanges. All of it proves a coordinated conspiracy to destroy my family and absorb my operations into yours. Valentino didn't even look at the folder. This is fantasy, paranoia, the ravings of a man who's lost control of his own people. Is it? Cataneo's voice was sharp. Then how do you explain this? He gestured to me. I stepped forward, my heart pounding, and placed a document on the table. It was a contract, the same one Santori had tried to get Cataneo to sign, the one with the hidden codes. This contract, I said, my voice steady despite my terror, was presented to Mr. Cataneo as a legitimate partnership agreement. But embedded within the legal language are codes from the old Sicilian mafia communication systems. Codes that reference assassination, territory transfer, and betrayal. I began reading aloud, translating the hidden meanings, explaining the proverbs and phrases that transformed innocent business language into instructions for murder and takeover. The room was absolutely silent as I spoke, every eye on me, and I felt the moment when I stopped being invisible, when they really saw me, when they realized what I knew. Valentino's face had gone pale. This is ridiculous. This girl is making up fairy tales. She's from Corleone, Cataneo interrupted. Her grandmother taught her the old codes before they died out. She understands the language your generation invented to hide your crimes, and she's just proven that you tried to kill me using methods you thought nobody remembered. The other bosses were murmuring now, examining the contract, reading the translations I'd provided. I could see the shift in the room, the balance of power tilting as they realized Valentino had been caught. Even if this were true, Valentino said, his voice tight. Even if there were some misunderstanding about the contract language, it doesn't prove anything. You've always been paranoid, Dario. Seeing conspiracies where there are none. Then explain the phone calls, Cataneo said. The ones between your sons and Santori. The ones where they discussed timelines for my assassination. The ones that were recorded and are currently in the possession of several federal agencies. That was a bluff. We had the recordings, but they weren't with federal agencies. But Valentino didn't know that. You're bluffing, he said, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. Am I? Cataneo smiled coldly. Would you like to bet your freedom on it? Because the way I see it, you have two choices. You can admit what you did, face the judgment of this council, and accept the consequences. Or you can lie, and I'll make sure those recordings end up with people who would love to put the entire Valentino family away for the rest of your lives. The room erupted. Valentino's sons stood, their hands moving toward weapons. Cataneo's guards moved forward. Other families' men positioned themselves, choosing sides in real time. But before violence could explode, the oldest boss in the room, a man named Salvatore Ricci, who'd been in the mafia since before I was born, raised his hand. Basta, he said quietly. Enough. Giacomo, is what Dario says true? Did you try to kill him? Valentino looked around the room, seeing no allies, no escape. His carefully constructed conspiracy was crumbling, exposed by a waitress who understood dead languages, and a boss who'd been smarter than he'd anticipated. It wasn't supposed to be like this, Valentino said finally. Dario's become too powerful, too reckless. He's bringing in too much federal attention. He needed to be removed for the good of everyone. By betraying our oldest traditions? Ricci's voice was sharp. By using the old codes to plot murder like we're still hiding from Mussolini? You've shamed us all, Giacomo. The vote was quick, unanimous. The Valentino family was declared rogue, their operations subject to partition among the other families. Giacomo and his sons were escorted out by neutral guards, their fate to be decided later, away from the eyes of legitimate businesses and federal surveillance. As the meeting dissolved, Cataneo turned to me. We're leaving, Now. I followed him out, through the mansion, into the waiting car. Marco drove fast, putting distance between us and the Hamptons, and I sat in silence, processing what had just happened. I'd just spoken in front of a room full of mafia bosses. I'd just exposed a conspiracy that would reshape criminal power in New York. I'd just made myself either incredibly valuable or incredibly dead. "You did well," Cataneo said after several miles. "Better than well. You saved my life again, Elena. For the second time." "What happens now?" My voice was hoarse. "Now the Valentino operations get divided up. The traitors in my organization have already been dealt with. My position is secure, stronger than it was before." He turned to look at me. "And you get to make a choice." "What choice?" "You've fulfilled your contract. You exposed the conspiracy, helped me survive the challenge, did everything I asked and more. You can take your payment and walk away. Start over somewhere far from here. Or..." He paused. "You can stay." "Stay?" "As my advisor, my translator. The person who understands the old ways and helps me navigate the new ones. I need someone I can trust, Elena. Someone who's not afraid to tell me the truth, who sees things others miss, someone who cares about more than just money and power. You're asking me to stay in this world, after everything? I'm offering you a choice. Real power, real influence, a chance to shape how things work from the inside rather than being invisible on the outside." He leaned closer. "You said you wanted to matter. You said you wanted to be seen. Working for me, you'd matter more than most people ever do in their entire lives." I thought about my empty apartment, my paid-off student loans, my mother who no longer had to work herself to death. I thought about Nona's warnings and Nona's lessons, how she'd prepared me for exactly this moment without knowing it. I thought about being invisible again, going back to a world where I served and smiled and disappeared into the background. And I thought about the past 3 weeks, working with Cataneo, matching wits with him, feeling genuinely challenged and valued for the first time in my life. "I need guarantees," I said. "Protection, a real salary, not consulting fees. And most importantly, I need to know that I'm not just another employee, that my voice actually matters." Cataneo smiled, and this time it was genuine, warm. "You just stood up to Giacomo Valentino in a room full of killers and exposed him using codes nobody else alive understands. Your voice matters, Elena. I promise you that." He extended his hand, and I looked at it, scarred, strong, offering me a future I'd never imagined. A future that was dangerous and complicated and completely insane, but also a future where I'd never be invisible again. I took his hand. "Then I'm in. For real this time. But I have conditions. Name them. No more killing unless absolutely necessary. If there's a way to solve a problem without violence, we try that first. And I want a say in how things are done. If I'm going to be your advisor, then you actually have to listen to my advice." "Done. What else?" "Teach me. Everything. How this world really works. The legitimate businesses, the gray areas, all of it. If I'm going to help you navigate it, I need to understand it completely." "Agreed. Anything else?" "One more thing." I met his eyes directly. No lies between us. If I'm risking my life for you, I deserve the truth. Always. Cataneo studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "No lies. You have my word." We shook on it, and I felt the weight of the decision settle over me. I'd just agreed to work for a mafia boss, to live in a world of codes and violence and moral complexity. Nonna would have been horrified, or maybe she would have understood. Maybe she'd taught me everything I needed precisely because she knew that some people were always going to be pulled into these worlds, and the best she could do was prepare me to survive them. The car pulled up to my apartment building. Marco opened the door, and Cataneo gestured for me to wait before getting out. Elena, he said quietly, thank you. For everything. For your courage, your intelligence, your honesty. You saved my life twice now. I don't forget debts like that. Neither do I replied. Which is why I'm staying. Because I owe you too. For seeing me when I was invisible. For trusting me when you had no reason to. For giving me a choice when you could have just made me disappear. Partners then. Partners. I got out of the car and walked into my building, feeling the weight of everything that had changed. I was no longer Elena Mazzini, struggling waitress. I was Elena Mazzini, advisor to Dario Cataneo, fluent in the language of betrayal and power. I'd gone from serving wine to the dangerous men who shaped the world to sitting beside them, my voice carrying weight they couldn't ignore. And as I unlocked my apartment door and stepped into the quiet space that suddenly felt too small for who I'd become, I thought about Nona's final lesson, the one she'd never spoken aloud, but had taught me through every story, every proverb, every warning. Some people are meant to be invisible, but some people are meant to be seen, to speak up, to change the shape of the world, through their courage and their voice. The trick is knowing which one you are and having the strength to accept it. I'd been invisible my whole life, but not anymore. Never again. And somehow I knew Nona would have been proud.